So I'm a pretty big fan of PvP-focused survival games, and one game that meets that criteria that I've been interested in ever since it was revealed a few years ago is Dune Awakening. Now, Dune Awakening is an upcoming open-world survival MMO game set in the Dune universe, which I think is a very good IP for a survival game. A lot of the elements of Arrakis just fits perfectly with what gameplay you would expect from a lot of survival games. But one big sentiment I've seen revolving around Dune Awakening from a lot of survival players and even more MMO players is that a lot of people seem to think that Dune Awakening is not going to be an MMO and it's just going to be very similar to other server-based survival games. So in this video, I want to go over all the information we have that's pointing to Dune Awakening being an actual MMO. And one of the first things I want to go over is who is actually developing Dune Awakening, because as a big MMO player, I know there's a bunch of studios and games that call themselves MMOs, but they're not really MMOs, and they're definitely not games I would consider to be MMOs. But Dune Awakening is being made by Funcom, which is a really old studio that's been around for over 30 years, and they're not a studio that I think would be calling something an MMO if it wasn't, because Funcom has a very long history of making full-scale MMOs. One of the first ones being a Conan the Barbarian MMO. They made the Secret World MMO. They made Anarchy Online. So they have a pretty long history of making full-scale MMOs, games that don't have any argument against them not being MMOs. They also have games in the survival genre, most importantly being Conan Exiles, which is one of their more recent, bigger games. And Conan Exiles is a server-based survival game. So when you start up the game, you go choose a server that can say have 80 people on it on a time, and that's the one server you're playing on. It's on an MMO. They don't call it an MMO. It will share a lot of the same survival elements of Dune Awakening. But then we get to Dune Awakening that they're specifically calling an MMO survival game. So as a studio throughout their entire history, they've only called games MMOs when they're actually MMOs. They have another survival game that's not an MMO that they don't call an MMO, and then they have a bunch of full-scale MMOs that they call MMOs. So just from their studio's history, I think it's a pretty low chance that they're going to claim this game's an MMO without it being an actual MMO and just being like some server-based game. But then we also have some pretty new information where they go a little bit more in detail with the actual player numbers. Now they start off by saying from some of the betas alone, some of these guilds on the game's Discord server have upwards of 150 to 200 people already. And by the late game, the goal is to have massive factions full of thousands of players vying for resources. And this is another iteration, which is something that they have said before, that they want their worlds in Dune Awakening to have literally thousands of people interconnected in basically the same servers, in the same economies, vying for the same resources or trading on the bazaars. So they want thousands of people interacting in some way. And they go on to give some additional information on how some of their servers are going to be split up. So servers are split in such a way that there are safe areas and risky ones, with them all stitched together through a bit of technical wizardry called server meshing. Now, server meshing is actually something we've seen in some other survival games. That means seamless movement across the whole thing. Funcom expects to start at about 40 players per server, with at least 10 times that in the deep desert areas where you'll face the proper conflict, with the goal being to have at least several thousand players online together at once. So there's quite a lot of information to unpack here. Now, one of the big pieces of information here being server meshing, and we've actually seen very similar iterations of this in other survival games. I think one of the first ones being a kind of failed survival game called Atlas that was made by a sister studio of the Ark Survival Evolved developers. Now, this was a massive survival game that used server meshing to basically combine 255 massive zones that were bigger than Ark Survival Evolved maps, and this would make up the entirety of what's basically their world map, and you would have these 255 zones, all of them having like a cap of 70 or 80 players. players, and you could go freely between every zone as long as those zones were not at server capacity. And the general idea is that there's no transition between all of those different servers. So it's basically just taking dozens or hundreds of servers, splitting them up with different sections of a game map, and having player caps on each one of those sections, so you could have thousands and thousands of people in the same overarching world or server, but there would just be some amount of server cap, so you wouldn't be able to have every one of those thousands of players at the same zone at the same time. But as said here, you'll be able to have over 400 people in the same zone in combat with each other if that conflict were to arise. And personally, as a big MMO player, someone who's kind of strict on what I would generally call an MMO, being able to have over 400 people in the same zone, being able to fight each other at the same time if they wanted to, is definitely something I would consider to be an MMO. And then past that, you'll be able to have thousands and thousands of people in the same overarching server, to where even though you wouldn't be able to have every single one of those people in the same area and fighting, they would all still be in the same economy, in the same world map. They would most likely have some type of like world chat where they could all chat to each other, and then you would basically break off into sections of all of the overarching players to where you could still actually fight. And I think that's actually one of the big differences between this and other survival games that have had this. Other survival games, even though they had this server meshing where there would be thousands of people in the same overarching map, you wouldn't be able to have like over 70 people in the same zone being able to fight. But once you're getting hundreds of people fighting in the same area, that's definitely an MMO. And I think there's some other elements in Dune Awakening that also helps with this MMO categorization. And I think one of the biggest ones is them having a bazaar or a player auction house where you can basically sell anything to each other. And because Dune as a franchise has such a big focus on political intrigue and all of these different factions or houses, they actually want this bazaar or auction house to be a pretty viable way to play the game. They talked about some different elements. So besides just selling resources or different schematics you find in the world, you'll even be able to sell blueprints of buildings. And this ties into their building system where you could build, say, a massive castle or this huge base. You would actually be able to blueprint your entire base, and you would be able to go sell that on the bazaar to any of these other thousands of players. They'd be able to take your blueprint of the base you built, place it down in the world, and then they would just have to get the resources and basically place it into that blueprint. And then when they got enough resources to finish it, they would complete the construction of this massive base. And that person who built the blueprint, that could be the main thing they do. They could go around gathering resources, building up all these bases, or maybe watchtowers, or maybe even smaller bases that are built when raiding other bases. And they can make all of these blueprints and go sell them on the bazaar to all these other players. And that's the way they could make their currency, and that could be the main thing they're trying to do in the game. And then you could have another player that is maybe completely focused on farming rare resources. Maybe they're really good at being sneaky, or they went into a lot of elements in the game that allows them to be more sneaky, and they're just running around trying to find all these rare resources that they're taking back to their base, taking to the bazaar, and they're a person that's known throughout these thousands of players to be somebody who's always selling the rarest resources. And this also scales up pretty heavily when you add in the guild systems into the game, where you'll be able to have potentially hundreds of people in your guild building together, fighting together. Maybe you have multiple people in your guild. It's kind of like your guild economists that just play the bazaar all the time and are making tons of currency for everybody in the guild. Then you're also going to have factions that will have thousands of players in them, and there'll be a handful of different factions you can choose between. And those factions are also going to pit massive groups of players against each other, even if they're in different guilds. So maybe there's multiple guilds in one faction. All those guilds may want to go fight another faction or try to take over this deep desert zone, and maybe they go have a 250 versus 250 battle in that zone. You'll be able to do all of that as well. All of this very much pointing towards Dune Awakening being a sandbox MMO with very heavy survival elements. Now, I do think there's still more information we need. We need to know how many different zones there are going to be, what's the different cap going to be in all of these zones, how many players are going to be able to be in one of these bigger overarching zones, how are all of these different meshed server zones going to work if they're already at player capacity? Is it just going to tell you, no, you're not allowed to go in there right now? Or is it say going to like put you in a queue to get into that other zone? So there's still some information we have, and we also don't know the information of how all of this is going to run at these massive player counts. Like if you have 400 or 500 people in one zone and they all get into a battle, most games that's not going to perform very well, even though some games have actually been able to do it. So there's definitely still a pretty big question mark around specifically the performance. Even if this doesn't perform super well, I would still very much consider it an MMO. Like I mentioned, if you're going to have 400 people fighting each other in the same zone, that's definitely an MMO, whether it's super laggy or not. But that's all I want to go over, so thanks for watching.